State Secretary Gattiker, Your Excellency, Mrs. Magennis, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to today's Swiss breakfast here at the Swiss Mission. While the Swiss breakfast is a well-established format, today's edition is in some respects a first, une première. First of all, because it is the first Swiss breakfast that I have the pleasure to open as the head of mission, having arrived this summer to Brussels, but also because it is the first edition of the Swiss breakfast that we hold in a hybrid format, considering the sanitary situation. This allows us to be together despite the challenging health situation. I would therefore like to extend a particularly warm welcome also to the people following us via the live stream from a distance. Today's breakfast looks at several ongoing discussions on the external dimension of migration. This has taken an important role in the context of the new Pact for Migration and Asylum, as you probably all know. Although most states agree that the development of partnerships is desirable, the path forward is still unclear. In this regard, some input could be gained by looking at certain policies developed at the national level. Through more than 50 projects, the migration partnership between Switzerland and Nigeria, which has just celebrated its 10-year anniversary, is a good example of how fruitful cooperation and dialogue can be. This could serve as an insightful starting point for the discussion today. Hence, without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to our panelists who will tell us more about this pivotal topic. And as the first person to speak, I am very happy to hand the floor to my colleague, Ambassador Obinna Onowu, Ambassador of Nigeria to the Kingdom of Belgium, the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, and the European Union. Thank you very much.
State Secretary Rita, Gattiker, sorry, Ambassador, Ms. Magennis. Good morning, everyone. I thought perhaps I wanted to say a short statement, but pardon me if I just make one or two more comments since I'm the only Nigerian here. First of all, we just want to thank the Swiss Mission for allowing us to join this very important event. The partnership we have with Switzerland has been a very long one. The collaboration has been very strong, and we've also had some very fruitful outcomes. And we felt that it's important that we are here to share maybe our own perspective on this partnership. When we were asked to sign the migration agreement with Switzerland in 2011, it wasn't a difficult thing for us because we've already had collaboration with Switzerland from 2003. And that collaboration was one based on the two terms we had here, respect and trust. We've worked together for 7-8 years, and it was so easy for us to sign on the agreement. And it was unique in the sense that it was one of the first agreements that we signed with any country. And unique also in the sense that at the time the discourse was on readmission, return of migrants. This one had a difference in the sense that apart from returns, there were issues of reintegration, and then also issues about the concerns of the migrants, then also concerns also about labor migration, I mean legal access to migration, which are very important concept that up to now we're still having difficulties in our discussions with other countries. So we think that it's been a model that lasted for over 10 years of fruitful collaboration, and we think that what we had with what we have with the Swiss government is actually what we can also share with in our discuss with Europe. At this moment, we're still having dialogue with the European Union on migration, and we last week we also had to cite this partnership as a way forward. So we are here, happy here to be here today. And there's so much we can say about this partnership, but what I want to end up with is cooperation is possible where there's a meeting of minds, countries of origin, countries of destination, and where you are also able to take on board the concerns of the migrants. So cooperation is not a difficult thing as we tend to read in the media and some of the articles. It's possible when you have issues of trust and issues of respect embedded in the consultations or the dialogue. So once again, I just want to say we are happy here, and then when the questions come, I'll be willing to answer one or two questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think Bernadette will. Good morning to all of you in the room, and good morning to all of you who are following us online today. So I'm Isabelle Ory from the Swiss television RTS, and I'll be the moderator today. So today for our Swiss breakfast on migration partnership and the external dimension of migration, I'm very pleased to introduce our own Swiss Secretary, Mr. Gattiker, and also Mrs. Magennis, who is head of the legal and policy and legal support unit at the UNHCR. Sorry, I always have trouble with that. So European Affairs Bureau here in Brussels. Thanks to both of you for being with us today. So here's how we will proceed. So first, both our panelists will make some introduction remarks. Then they will have a discussion that I will monitor. And of course, at the end, we will have time for your questions. If you are following us online, please feel free to leave your questions in the chat during the discussion, and I will read as many of them as possible at the end. And if you are in the room, of course, you'll just have to raise your hand at the end. We aim at wrapping it all up around 10:45, 11. So let's start. So Mr. Gattiker, we will start with you, and you will give us your insights on the Swiss-Nigeria partnership and also your personal experience of it.
Yes, thank you, Isabelle Ory, for the kind introduction. Thank you, Ambassador Obinna Onowu, for your warm words, and thank you, Ambassador Rita for your introduction, and of course, thank you to you and your team for hosting us here today and for preparing this wonderful event. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be on a panel with my distinguished colleague, Sophie Magennis, here at the Swiss mission to the EU. I will take this opportunity to reflect on the migration partnership between Switzerland and Nigeria in the context of the current European discussions on the external dimension of migration policy and the Pact for Migration and Asylum. For me, our partnership with Nigeria is one possible example of what is often described as balanced and win-win partnerships. As some of you might know, I have been active in the field of migration for quite a while. As a consequence, I have had the privilege of being personally involved as a co-chair for many years of this joint technical committee between Nigeria and Switzerland, elaborating and developing this partnership on migration. I can personally appreciate how far Switzerland and Nigeria have come together. I have also participated in numerous European discussions on the issue of partnerships with country of origin, transit and destination, but also on the importance of having a coherent and harmonized European migration policy. I'm convinced that these two dimensions, internal to Europe and external with our partners, are complementary, and the progress achieved in one dimension can only strengthen the other. I will allow myself to speak openly today as we do amongst friends. There have also been difficult years for the bilateral relationships between Switzerland and Nigeria on matters of migration. In 2010, 1 year before the conclusion of the migration partnership, a Nigerian citizen tragically died during an attempted forced repatriation from Switzerland to Nigeria. This was a difficult moment for all of us, and of course, especially for Nigeria, As a consequence, all repatriation flights were suspended. At the same time, Switzerland continued to receive high numbers of asylum claims from Nigerian citizens, most of whom were not in need of international protection and were therefore expected to return to Nigeria. So back in 2010, our relationship was in crisis. But together, we have been able to turn crisis into opportunity and open a new chapter in our bilateral relationship. Why were we able to do this? Well, first of all, we reached a common understanding that both Switzerland and Nigeria have legitimate interests regarding migration that must be adequately explored and taken into account. This may sound obvious, but we all know that there is always a danger of being too focused on our own immediate priorities and not taking the time to really listen to our partners. Thanks to this common understanding, we established a relationship of trust and mutual respect, which allowed us to also address the more difficult topics. It allowed us to achieve the much quoted spirit of partnership, in which both parties have a clear interest in moving forward together. The next step was turn dialogue into action and the implementation on the ground. This is the only way to sustainably address the issue of irregular migration and ensure safe, regularly and orderly migration both within the region and towards Europe. Migration, of course, touches many different policy areas, which are usually covered by different government agencies. This is why we have teamed up with Foreign Affairs, the Swiss Federal Police and others. Our so-called whole-of-government approach is institutionalized through a dedicated interagency and interministerial coordination mechanism. So when I hear that the EU wants to strengthen its Team Europe approach, I can only welcome these efforts. It is only by speaking with one voice that we can achieve effective cooperation with our partners. Nigeria followed the same approach on their side, so together we could really make things move. We, for example, put together a joint asylum and return action plan in 2013, or grouped together the various sectoral dialogues by establishing the annual Switzerland-Nigeria Days in 2016. We also reached out to the private sector with Nestlé Nigeria and Nestlé Switzerland, establishing a high-quality training and internship program which we support. The rest, as to say, is history. Switzerland and Nigeria have successfully implemented 50 innovative projects across areas as diverse as migration, governance and border management, fighting human trafficking, police cooperation, protecting vulnerable migrants, youth employability, labor migration, agriculture, as well as return and reintegration or the exchange of young diplomats. This leads me to the last key ingredient to a successful partnership I would like to mention: an ongoing commitment at all levels. A migration partnership is not about signing agreements and good photo opportunities. No, it is an ongoing process that must be nurtured, just like Nigeria and Switzerland have done over the last 10 years, and certainly will for years to come. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Secretary Gattiker. Mrs. Magennis, the floor is yours. So we'll hear on your view on migration partnerships and the principle they should respect, especially in the framework of the European Pact on Migration that was presented by the Commission last year.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Good morning, everybody. Ambassador of Switzerland, Ambassador of Nigeria, State Secretary, Isabelle. It's a pleasure for UNHCR to be here this morning, and I would like to thank very much the Ambassador of Switzerland for this important initiative and the Ambassador of Nigeria for being here today and discussing this important bilateral relationship that Switzerland and Nigeria have concluded. Indeed, initiatives like this are very important because there is a lot of discussion going on at the moment in Brussels about partnerships between EU member states and countries outside of the European Union. And it's very important that those discussions are informed by existing best practice. So it's very good to hear today about what sounds like a real relationship which has managed to make progress and bring benefits both to Nigeria and to Switzerland. And this is something I think that we can all learn from. Also, this is an important initiative because I think too often we see discussions based here in Brussels which involve European partners talking about answers to global problems, but without the partners from outside of Europe. And I think that we need to really stick to the maxim of nothing about us without us, and ensure that when we're discussing partnerships, we do that together with representatives from countries, including on the African continent, to make sure that those discussions are inclusive. As we know, in September last year, the European Commission published a pact on migration and asylum. And as part of that pact, the idea of developing partnerships between the Union and what are termed as third countries, countries outside of the European Union, are a core part of that pact on migration and asylum. The idea is to undertake initiatives both within the European Union and globally to try and improve the response of the European Union to migration and asylum issues. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has broadly welcomed the pact and the proposals set out in the pact. We've also welcomed this partnership model and the idea of partnerships, seeing them as very consistent with the Global Compact on Refugees, which was affirmed by UN member states at the UN General Assembly in December 2018. So as part of that Global Compact on Refugees, UNHCR speaks about finding solutions to global refugee issues, and one of those solutions is working very closely together with host countries and trying to find solutions together with them. So it's a consistent idea with the Global Compact on refugees. We have a couple of broad recommendations that we have set out to the EU on how to develop these partnerships, given that discussions are going on at the moment. And I would echo very much the remarks made by both ambassadors this morning about the need for such partnerships to be based on respect and trust and built on a concrete basis so that they can be successful going forward. We understand now that the European Union, to further this partnership approach, is developing action plans on migration with a number of targeted countries. And for UNHCR, it's very important that those action plans be comprehensive and balanced, and above all, that they be designed jointly with the partner countries, and that they not be one-sided with the mere objective of pursuing the EU's own interests. There should not be an over-focus on returns and readmission, but a balance within these partnership approaches. Also, it's very important that these partnerships are consistent with processes that have been going on for quite some time to develop regional cooperation models. And these frameworks include the Valletta, Khartoum, Rabat processes, as well as ongoing processes that are happening in EU financial programming. So I'll just touch on a few key recommendations and then answer further questions in the dialogue. I think the first recommendation, which I've mentioned already, is that the action plans be tailor-made and designed jointly with the partner country. Secondly, the action plans should be consistent with the Team Europe initiatives, which we heard the State Secretary mention earlier, and the coordination between these partnerships and those Team Europe initiatives should be assured. Thirdly, we need to make sure that legal pathways to protection are embedded in the action plans and the Team Europe initiatives. I'll say a few words on that later, but these legal pathways for protection include resettlement, they include complementary pathways, which include labour mobility, people travelling to the European Union on work visas, on student visas, on scholarships, and also a very important pathway is family reunification. There are many family members of refugees with status in the European Union who have an entitlement under the EU's Family Reunification Directive to come to the European Union, but it's very difficult for people to actually access family reunification in practice. So these legal pathways need to be embedded and given a high priority within the partnerships. Fourthly, it's important that the European Union, through these partnerships, works closely with the chair of the regional processes, which I mentioned earlier. Fifthly, it's important to recognise the important role of cities and local authorities along key migratory routes and ensure that the funding instruments of the European Union are able to also support those cities and local authorities. This kind of support is very, very important, including to ensure appropriate responses to trafficking, to protect victims of trafficking, and to ensure referral of possible victims of trafficking to appropriate services. And finally, we have encouraged the European Union to use its sanctions policy to target human traffickers along the key migratory routes. We think a lot more could be done to tackle impunity and improve interstate and intercontinental cooperation to that effect. And we think that the issue of trafficking needs to also have a core place in partnerships and Team Europe initiatives going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That will make a very good base for our discussion. But first, I would like to come back a bit briefly maybe to the Nigeria-Switzerland partnership, because I was very impressed when I read all the documentation about the world respect and trust that you both mentioned, but they were really said by officials from both governments several times. So how do you achieve that on a long period of time? Is it human contacts? Is it the fact that you took into account the interest of both parties? So maybe I ask both of you. I don't know who wants to answer first. Maybe the ambassador. But I don't know where the microphone is. It's gone.
Thank you very much. I have to be a little frank, and talking about respect and mutual trust. I think respect in the sense that we, from the Swiss side, we saw a commitment. And as I did mention at that time, I think it was popular now for countries to return migrants back to their countries of origin. And when we raised our concerns, one, that we are not against returning migrants to Nigeria, but then we were actually concerned about a number of things, the human rights. We are also concerned about reintegration. And what we saw on the Swiss side was they listened. And at the same time, not just listening, they were also able to discuss with us projects to help in the reintegration. So, but before we signed the agreement, we've had this collaboration. So migrants, when they are picked up, and then we ensure that we identify them as Nigerians, and there was cooperation on the side also of the Swiss authorities in the process, which was to us reassuring. And then at the same time, before they are moved, we also ensure that properties and all the other things they had, we also taken along with them. And then at the same time, when we agreed on the projects, that actually the Swiss were also forthcoming. So when you have a situation that promises are made and those promises are fulfilled, it helped also to build trust. Respect in the sense that they also respected us, the country, to take decisions on who our nationals are. So it's not just picking anybody, maybe a Gabonese or Ghanaian, and then you send them to Lagos or send them to Abuja. We had to interview and go through the processes, ask for the documents, and then get their cooperation. So we had that in terms of respect for us, at least to take decision on who our nationals are. And then the trust in the sense that, okay, the promises also made were also fulfilled. So along the line, it was easy for us to proceed without much problems, apart from the one the State Secretary mentioned in 2010. But for 10 years, on the average, it's been a very fruitful collaboration, and we think it sets also the basis for maybe discuss with the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because Switzerland has 6 different migration partnerships, if I'm correct. So what makes this one more successful, or where is this one so emblematic?
The first important thing is that we do not have a readmission agreement. We have a migration partnership, and we had a difficult moment after this tragical death of this young Nigerian. But I think we both realized that we have to work on 2 evidence. The first one is that irregular migration is a challenge and a problem, not only for the destination country, but also for the country of origin. That's the first evidence. And the second evidence is, which is important, that an orderly and safe migration, regular migration, is an opportunity for both countries. And so we worked on these 2 pillars. And we have, on the one hand, reintegration projects, but we have also a lot of projects with the option to give a perspective for young Nigerians on the ground. We have also project, for example, this partnership that we have with Nestlé Nigeria and Nestlé Switzerland on the training and education of engineers. Nestlé is engaged in that, and they have a very good education in Nigeria, and the best and the biggest talents can then move to Switzerland, work there. Our experience is that a lot of them have very good job opportunities after that, and I think that is one thing which is really important. We should work together with the private sector to enlarge also the opportunities of governments to act and to create a perspective. We had also an exchange, a very good project on agriculture when Nigerian students of agriculture came to Switzerland to exchange knowledge and best practice, because Nigeria is a country with huge potential to develop agriculture and yes, and so we identified fields of common interest, and we then went to action. And I think that with these actions also, and with this also very positive experience that we made in the project, also the exchange that we have beside this project. For example, I had so many exchange with my co-chair at that time when I was co-chair of the Joint Technical Committee, State Secretary Dr. Martin from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we really had we created a lot of opportunity to understand better what is important for both countries. And yes, it's really it's a fascinating partnership with a lot of future and a lot of other perspective.
Mrs. Magennis, what's your take on that? Do you think the key is really finding the right balance between the interests of both partners?
Yes, I think it is, and I think it's also in recognising the opportunities. I think, as the State Secretary has said, the opportunities that can flow for both countries in making sure that legal migration routes, but also readmission and reintegration supports function appropriately. I think that's where you can make some progress on achieving the right balance. As UNHCR, we've been working with the private sector on coming up with ways to enhance labour mobility. And there is lots of opportunity for us to make some headway there. There are very big companies, human resources companies, global companies that are engaging with us, who are interested in being able to hire refugees, people with protection needs. And there are organizations, including an organization called Talent Beyond Boundaries, that actually works as a human resource company for refugees and people with protection needs. The idea is that if a person has for example, a protection need, if they were able to apply for a job and arrive in that country with a work visa and a livelihood, isn't that a much better way for people to be able to move? So we recently did an online workshop, and we had huge interest from big employers, both in Europe and in America and in Canada, and we're working to see how we can expand on those possibilities. We also had a senior colleague from Geneva on mission here in Brussels yesterday, meeting with the Commission. We're meeting with the different DGs that are involved in developing employment possibilities to see how far we can try and expand the idea of labour pathways. And of course for UNHCR, we're focusing on those people who may have protection needs. I think also it's very important for us to get the messaging right on partnerships, because unfortunately sometimes the way these partnerships are spoken about or indeed covered in the media can often lead to a chilling effect outside of Europe, because the partnerships are not seen as something that are going to benefit countries or citizens outside of the European Union. And I think we need to encourage EU member states and EU agencies to be careful about the manner in which they speak about partnerships, and to adopt the kind of narrative and messaging that we hear today, which is based on respect and trust, but also from a perspective of opportunity, rather than just seeing it simply as one problem being solved, looking at it at a multifaceted relationship with lots of opportunities on both sides. If we can get that kind of message forward, I think we can develop much more political space to advance these kinds of initiatives.
Thank you. We will just touch on that in a few seconds, but I just wanted to ask you, Mr. Gattiker, a last question about the numbers of maybe asylum seekers coming from Nigeria, or how does it work for the returns, and just to give us an idea of that you managed to stop forced returns, stuff like that.
Yes, 10 years ago, Nigeria was always among the most important destination country in the field of asylum in Switzerland. A very low protection rate, so it was really not. They were not in need of international protection, and in this last 10 years, it was a very strong decrease. So we have just a few asylum claims, and I think we gave also a message together to our population, to the Nigerian population and also to the Swiss population. And that was also something which was very positive. For example, also a clear message towards irregular migration, but you are only credible when you also create opportunities for legal pathways. But it was also a very good lesson for the Swiss population. For example, we had a project on police cooperation, and then Nigerian police officers came to Switzerland, and they made joint visits to hotspots, for example, of small criminalities, drug criminality. And that was not only a message to these Nigerian involved, who created a problem for the Nigerian government, but it was also a strong message that a European country and an African country are fighting together against for both sides very difficult phenomena. And yes, it was also some sort of education for our population to make that also visible, this cooperation and this common interest.
So do you think that such bilateral partnership between two countries can be a model for a multinational organization like the EU? Is it possible to replicate that between the EU and a country, or maybe between the EU and a number of countries? Or do you maybe lose the human touch, the contacts? How is it possible to replicate? Mrs. Magennis, sorry, question for you.
I think it is possible to use the good practices that we're speaking about here and develop them more broadly. The European Union has a very big footprint outside of the European Union, with delegations in all countries and a whole network of relationships. And I think the message needs to be that in deepening the relationships with countries outside of the European Union, that a holistic approach is taken. And I think it was very important what you said, State Secretary, about an approach only being credible if it includes viable legal pathways. And I think sometimes we see relationships constructed which don't really have a viable legal pathway opportunity, or we see very small numbers of people being able to benefit from certain countries, not only for visas, but for legal pathways. So I think the idea of developing these kind of partnerships requires, the one we've heard about this morning has been developed over many, many years, but does require that kind of personal engagement and developing the plans together with the partner countries. So I think it's not going to work if officials in Brussels come up with a certain approach and then go and present it as a fait accompli. Indeed, there are many discussions going on with countries to try and develop those projects, but I think that has to be the approach. Like all things in diplomacy, it starts with that personal touch. There's certainly the diplomatic reach of EU member states and the EU institutions, and we hope that is followed. And for us, the key is to make sure that within those arrangements, there are credible elements within those arrangements on things like legal pathways, on developing protection space, both within the countries concerned and within the European Union. That might be something we will get onto again later on in the discussion. But I think the world is watching a series of situations within the European Union where the Union is not dealing effectively with displacement issues within the European Union, which are comparatively very small. If we take, for example, the incidence of internal displacement in northern Nigeria, which the Nigerian authorities are tackling and working with together with UNHCR, the scale of that displacement is far greater than anything we see within the European Union, and yet the European Union is struggling a little bit with that approach. So I think another broad message is that we need to avoid a situation where the European Union puts all of its eggs in the basket of partnership and thinks the solution lies outside of the European Union. I think countries outside of the European Union need to see the Union make progress as well on its internal dimension, on asylum within the EU, and I think that will also help to create the space for these kind of partnerships to be developed on a respectful basis going forward.
Secretary, do you also think that this bilateral approach could be transported at EU level with the Team Europe and approach they have? Do you see similarities or?
You see, it's difficult for me to say because we developed a specific partnership, but I think the basic principle to take also into account the interest and legitimate interest of a destination country, I think that is fundamental. Because Nigeria, for example, has also huge challenges with regard to internally displaced people. Is also a destination country in the region, and these issues and these answers, which should be elaborated in the field of protection in the region, prevention of irregular migration, that are in the both interests of the country of origin, but also in Europe. And I think we should develop on this common understanding. You see. And because often they are very close, and work on that, and return as a unique option is not the solution.
So not a model for not a one size fits all, but more tailor-made partnership.
No, really partnership in the sense of taking account both interests. So we can move on, because return is not a solution for Europe. It's an important element, but what is more important is to prevent irregular migration in the region, and to prevent that young people without a concrete economic perspective came to Europe and crossed the Mediterranean and triggered by human traffickers and smugglers. that is an important answer to give to this phenomena, and return is just one element, you see. And often, as I already said, the interests are really the same, because also Nigeria is a destination country and knows very well in which a situation European countries are with the challenge of irregular migration.
Do you maybe want to say, because we're talking about Nigeria, I find that maybe you should give us your view on how to work with the EU as an international organization, 27 member states. Is it more complicated? Do you talk to member states? Do you talk to the Commission? How does it work?
For the European Union, we've also been having dialogue with the European Union on migration from Nigeria to countries in Europe. And I think, like what's been said here, I think the principles are very important. The principles of trust, respect, and then also trying to take care of the interests of all the different sides, not just return, as the State Secretary has said, also looking at the concerns from the Nigerian side, as well as the migrants themselves. Because for it to be sustainable, if you return a migrant today, and the livelihood is difficult for the migrant to settle in, the migrant might want to do another journey, which is what we are seeing. They move back and they just come back. So the issue is that what is sustainable? To have a sustainable migration policy, we need to have a balance, as the State Secretary has mentioned. And I think what we may not actually say that what the partnership we have with the Switzerland should suffice, but the principles are very important. They are key to the dialogue. And I believe if they introduce these principles, they are going to have a lot of cooperation from the side of countries of origin. Because what we hear every day is that the countries of origin are not willing to cooperate. Cooperation or lack of it, it's not just an issue of countries of origin. They are not cooperating because their concerns also have not been addressed. And if their concerns are not addressed, what happens is that you keep having these flows. They keep moving. People come back, come here, you take them back, and maybe in the next 1 year they come back. So the issue there is that once we are able to look at in a comprehensive manner, as the UNHCR has mentioned, if we look at some of the points have been made in these presentations, it's just for us to take them on board. If we take these issues on board, I think we're going to address this matter substantially. I think we should just move from discussions also to walking the talk. Whatever we agree on, we just have to have concrete steps or projects. And these projects will help to build trust, as we are seeing. Once you start building trust, then you are able to get the support also of the countries of origin. Then you're able to have some success. So these discussions can continue except we see an understanding on the side of the various stakeholders. And then also looking more importantly, the interests of the migrants, because the migrants are in the middle of this. So what are the interests of the migrants? That's, we think, is very important.
Thank you very much, sir. You were mentioning that the signals that the EU sends are very important, and we see that some member states of the EU have a very tough position on migration returns. We talk about Fortress Europe at the same time, so in the media, and there are countries who sign their own agreements with African countries, really focusing on returns. How do you see that? Do you think it should stop? But how to stop it when member states are sovereign in that matter?
Mm-hmm. I think some of the more damaging discussions that we see at the moment are discussions around what can be termed externalization or outsourcing is another term that is used. But essentially these are proposals put forward by some states that any asylum seekers that arrive to the European Union would be transported to some other country for that country to do the asylum processing. We don't agree with this approach as UNHCR. We don't think it's the correct approach. But we also think that there's a negative impact in such proposals being talked about in the media, because it makes countries outside of the European Union feel like perhaps they should not trust the European Union, or that they feel that the intention of the Union might be to divest itself of any responsibility for asylum seekers and seek to have all of that responsibility taken by other countries. And there's a fairness issue in all of this. We are living at the moment in a world of a great crisis in forced displacement, with over 80 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. But the vast majority of those are in developing countries. Only a very small proportion are within the European Union. And an idea at the heart of the Global Compact on refugees, and also at the heart of these partnerships, is the idea that protection space, meaning places where people can get protection, would grow. That there be investment in countries in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, so that more countries have functioning asylum systems. More countries would provide livelihoods for people who have been displaced. That's the goal, I think, of the Global Compact on refugees. It's also the goal of the European Union to try and enhance the space for protection globally. And we really fear that these discussions around externalization or outsourcing, they shrink that space. They place a chilling effect on those kinds of initiatives. Because, to put it simply, why would a country outside of the European Union develop its asylum system and develop its protection systems if the only thing that they think will happen is that they will become a candidate for EU member states to send asylum seekers to them, for them to manage those cases. So we're encouraging the European Union to have and all member states, to have a more positive narrative around the willingness of EU member states to work together to deal with properly the asylum seekers who arrive in the European Union, to take decisions on the merits in those cases. Asylum seekers arriving in the European Union, those in need of protection, should remain and be integrated. Those who are not in need of protection and have no other reason to remain in the country should be offered assisted voluntary return, including in partnership with the IOM, and reintegration support on return. And if they are not willing to avail of assisted voluntary return, then eventually return needs to happen, but in full dignity and respect for the human rights of those people, and with reintegration support when they return. So it's very important to understand that these kind of discussions and proposals that we hear coming from some EU member states saying that they are in discussions with X country to send all of their asylum seekers there, that can have a very negative impact on the broader solutions that we're all seeking. And we would encourage states to avoid those kinds of proposals. Thanks.
To maybe follow up on that, but here in Brussels, we at the moment, there's a lot of talk about the external dimension of migration and of the Pact, but it's supposed to be a pathway to find a solution globally on the Pact. But is it a pathway, or is it an alibi because the EU member states disagree on what they want as far as migration is concerned? Do you see this whole discussion as something that could help the Pact, or that hides the fact that there's no agreement between the Europeans?
You see, management of migration is something which is very, very complicated on various levels, and I think what makes it more difficult that we do not have the protection issue, because we have really also migration poverty, migration pressure for other grounds, and so we have to work on both. For me, it's clear to externalization of asylum procedure that will never works. and that will never work, because do we really want that, for example, Tunisia becomes a destination country for various migrations flows from Africa, to go there and be subjected to asylum procedure? Do we really want that? Do we realize what problems we create for a country like Tunisia? And what is with all the others with negative asylum decision? Do we really believe that then they will accept that and turn back to their country of origin? These are illusions. So we have to work on all the issues together, which are correctly mentioned in the Pact. We also believe, as Swiss government, that the Pact on migration and asylum, with this broad approach, is the right one, and I think we should move on all these various elements, and they are all together important. It is not sufficient to make just rapid and fair asylum procedures. It's not sufficient to elaborate the European return policy. We need all the elements together. It is very complicated, but we do not have an option. Migration pressure is here. Migration is, as I said, not only a challenge for Europe, but also for the country of origins. And we have not an alternative then to move on all these issues, and we will not have rapid answers to the phenomena. It seems that on return and the external dimension, there is some sort of consensus among European member states. But my experience is then, when it goes to the details of these two issues, it becomes very complicated. Because, for example, one country has a good experience with regard to return with one country of origin. Does this European country offers that option to all the others? That is an open question, and so on and so on. So it will take time, the discussion, but we do not have an alternative, because migration pressure is here and will increase, clearly increase. When you see the last 10 years and all the crisis and possible grounds for forced migration, then it's obvious that the migration pressure will increase.
What's your take on that, on the fact that the external dimension of the Pact is put forward? Do you think, what signal does it send also to the rest of the world that you were mentioning earlier, the fact that it's very difficult for the Europeans to agree between themselves on the internal dimensions, but so do they focus on the external? Because it's easier. We see, for instance, Home Affairs ministers discussing the external dimension of the Pact a lot, where they should maybe focus on solving the issues between themselves. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's to be expected sometimes that when discussions are so difficult internally within the European Union, that the focus turns to other initiatives. Now, in saying that, it's important that there is a focus on the external dimension. We need to focus much more on the root causes of why people flee in the first place. We need to ensure much more support for host countries. The majority of host countries, of course, being outside of the European Union. We need to provide support to those host countries, not just in terms of financial support, but also in terms of resettlement. We need to provide more support to countries of transit. So all of those areas of focus are very important. We need to do much more to provide livelihoods for people who are displaced in countries outside of the European Union, so that they're not forced to engage in dangerous journeys for onward movement. That means increasing livelihoods and also humanitarian funding. Unfortunately, it remains the case that in many areas humanitarian funding is there's such a gap that people are forced to move on from countries that they fled to because they cannot avail of sufficient humanitarian support for them and their families. We saw similar initiatives or similar difficulties in the early years of the Syrian displacement crisis, where Syrian families who had not managed to secure education for their children for several years began to move on from countries where they had found safety elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. So all of these things we need to avoid in the future. We need to have that focus on the external dimension. However, we cannot put so much focus on the external dimension as to take an unbalanced approach. And there needs to be progress on the internal dimension, because I think the European Union, to be a credible actor externally, has to demonstrate that it can do what it is asking other states to do. So in encouraging other countries to work in partnership with each other, to build relationships of trust, to try and tackle onward movement, the European Union needs to make progress within the Union on exactly those same issues. And it's particularly more important because the numbers of people arriving in the European Union are comparatively small. Yes, there are larger numbers of people moving onward within the European Union. That needs to be tackled. But the number of people arriving to the European Union seeking asylum are relatively small. So to be a credible actor, progress needs to be made. On the question around the Justice and Home Affairs ministers, we would encourage the Justice and Home Affairs ministers to maintain a focus on the internal dimension, even if those discussions are difficult. They need to persist, and diplomatic progress needs to be made. We've sent the same message to the two agencies of the European Union that focus on asylum and returns. So we have the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, which is based in Valletta. It will shortly become a new, fully fledged European Union agency for asylum early next year. We also have Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard, based in Warsaw. These two agencies are by far the biggest agencies in the European Union. All of the other agencies are small in comparison with these two agencies in terms of their budget, their staffing, which has grown exponentially in recent years. And these agencies, we would encourage them to continue to focus on fixing things internally, and again to avoid the temptation of overly focusing on the external dimension. There are important roles for these agencies to play. They are now posting liaison officers externally. EASO will be getting more involved in resettlement. They're involved in capacity building, and Frontex has liaison officers outside of the European Union. Those initiatives are helpful, but the focus needs to remain on the internal dimension. We know things are difficult. The discussions on solidarity are very hard. Member states are dealing with some difficult issues, but we believe that they're manageable. The numbers are manageable. The tools and the laws are there. It's a question of implementing EU law and living up to the principles and standards of not just EU law, but the right to asylum, which is enshrined in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Thank you very much. Well, that concludes the first part of our discussion. We'll now go to the questions. I'll first take a question from the people following us online. So there's a question for you, actually, Mrs. Magennis. What is exactly the role of the UNHCR in the current EU debate on the external dimension of migration? Do you assist? Do you go to meetings as well? Do you give them advice? How does it work?
Yes, we have provided advice, for example, on the Pact on migration and asylum. So we produced recommendations on what we wanted to see within the Pact. We also engage at a very high level through our High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, who was here in Brussels only some weeks ago, meeting with the commissioners, vice presidents of the Commission. He maintains a very good and active dialogue with the European Commission. We have an active dialogue as well with EU member states at the very high level and at the technical level. There are, of course, some discussions that are taking place within member states to which we are not privy to. So we are aware that action plans are being developed. We're not involved in the drafting of those action plans, but we have shared our broad recommendations with member states. and with the European Commission. From time to time as well, the High Commissioner for Refugees is invited to attend meetings of the Justice and Home Affairs Ministers, meetings of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He also recently addressed the European Parliament, the plenary session of the European Parliament on the 11th of November, just recently. So there's a lot of high-level engagement that's taking place and a lot of engagement at the technical level. We're also heavily involved, of course, as UNHCR at country level. We are operational wherever there are forced displacement issues, and we engage very closely with European Union delegations and member states in those countries. So I would categorise our approach as sharing broad recommendations on advocacy, sharing some concrete suggestions, including through our engagement on the rollout of the Global Compact on refugees, and providing that kind of advice. But the development of the specific action plans themselves are a question for the member states and the institutions.
Okay. Is there a question in the room? Yes, please. Could you please raise so that we can see you on camera? Thank you very much.
Thank you very
introduce yourself.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. My name is Josephine Liebel. I work for ECRE, the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. I really appreciated the exchange, and I would like to ask all panelists and also the ambassador of Nigeria about the issue of visa policy and visa measures. We all know, I think, organizations that work with partners in third countries, how difficult it is to receive visas to travel to the EU for work, to visit families, and that's not even starting looking at the protection-specific visas. So regular migration to the EU is something that has been mentioned already as one of the key issues to be addressed. And I was wondering whether the panelists could comment on the recent changes in EU rules related to visa restrictions in the way which basically mean that the EU and member states can assess or are assessing annually cooperation with third countries on return, and may then, depending on their assessment, decide to restrict visas even further. This is something that we have seen recently happen to the Gambia and to all citizens coming from the Gambia. So I would be interested to hear reflections about how such a measure from the EU side impacts on the potential to have mutually beneficial partnerships with third countries, but also what that might mean for patterns of irregular migration from third countries to the EU. Thank you.
Secretary Gattiker, do you want to answer that? Maybe the microphone, while the microphone is going to the ambassador afterwards.
Yes, with regard to visa policies and also access for international protection in Switzerland, we have created a specific visa type called humanitarian visa, so that it is an option for someone who is really in a concrete situation, risk for life, integrity, liberty, etc., to launch a humanitarian visa on a Swiss embassy abroad. It was in the Syrian context a very important instrument. We delivered 8,500 visas in a broad concept of family reunification as a humanitarian answer to the dramatic increase of the crisis in 2013. And also with regard to Afghanistan, it could be an option to grant a humanitarian visa, but it is not a sufficient answer to the Afghanistan crisis, because we believe that the answer is specifically in the country itself. The humanitarian aid must be the priority. And with regard, what was the second part of your questions, the topic? Yes, the negative conditionality. You see, it is one instrument more, and it can be last resort in a situation where you are confronted with a country which is not interested at all to cooperate. But I think the more important path is to build trust and respect with this destination country, because Then you can also have and create answers on the ground in the region. And this Article 25A of the Visa Codex covers only the aspect of return. So I think we need a broader approach. But we welcomed the instrument because it could be the last resort, and we should never forget that for each country in the world to turn back their own citizens is, in our point of view, an obligation in the international public law. But I think it's one element of a broad migration policy. But it is for sure not the instrument to resolve all the problems.
Mr. Ambassador?
You raised a very important question, and I think it's one issue most countries in Africa or governments are actually concerned about. When you talked about internal issues, I believe it's also one of the issues that needs to be addressed within Europe between the foreign ministries and maybe those in charge of immigration. We see a lot of rejection of visa requests, and even for students, even when students have even paid for fees in schools here, visas are still not given. And we cannot delink visa rejections to some of these movements we also have here. We think that the issue has to be revisited because sometimes even for government officials to come for meetings, it's a big problem. Visas are rejected. And we try to deal with that with various countries because if government officials suffer that, students who paid fees, school fees also suffer that, then there's a problem. And we're not talking of the populace who also move as a result. Some will say maybe they applied for visas and they don't get their visas. So we cannot delink the two issues, rejection of visas, the number of visas, and the movements. But we think it's one of the issues that has to be addressed internally. Most times when you talk to some missions, European missions there in Africa, they tell you, no, it's the problem of the immigration section. The ambassador doesn't have any control. But you have, with what we have seen and what we also have said in terms of the linkage returns and maybe root causes of migration, we argued that for almost 18 years or so, past 18 years in Geneva. We've seen the reality today. So it's only when we have discussions, frank discussions between countries of origin and countries of destinations that we're able to get to the root of the problem, and then we're able to get sustainable solutions. But I think it's an issue that has to be addressed within Europe, as they also address the external aspects of migration. It's also impossible to look at the internal aspect of it, how the systems can work better within Europe.
Thank you. Mrs. Magennis, your take on that?
Thank you, Josephine, for that very important question. And I think a key point is that any measures that are used by the European Union, they need to be employed in a way that do not undermine partnerships. And we've been speaking this morning about all of the principles that are important in partnerships. All measures should also be proportionate. And when we're talking about proportionate measures, let's keep in mind the fact that much more needs to be done on the ability of, or creating possibilities for refugees to be able to access family reunification. Despite a very good legal framework within the European Union on the Family Reunification Directive, it is so hard for people who have an entitlement to come to the European Union under family reunification to actually access that. That can be women and children in vulnerable situations with a family member with refugee protection status in the European Union, and they cannot access a visa to come to the European Union under family reunification. The rules are too complex, they're too difficult, and there's no support. So I think we need to again have balance in this discussion, and in order to be proportionate, we would encourage EU member states to do much more to work on fixing the problem when it comes to family reunification visas, in the first instance. I think clearly we need to advance on return and readmission by ensuring, I think as the State Secretary has said, that people who are found not to be in need of protection are offered assisted voluntary return, and that return functions in practice. There's been a lot of work on the obstacles to return, and indeed the European Union will soon be appointing a return coordinator, and there'll be much more work happening on return. But many of those obstacles on return have not yet been addressed substantially. We need to improve the quality of return decisions that are taken in some EU member states. We need to improve the timeliness of them. Sometimes people receive a return decision after waiting 10 years or more in an asylum procedure in the European Union. And by that stage, their life has become very complex. They're very entwined in the society where they are. So poor return decisions, or return decisions that take a very long time to emerge, are key obstacles to return. I think another issue, of course, that we have to address is the imbalance between remittances that migrants who are living in the European Union are sending to their home countries, and the amount of humanitarian or development assistance that those countries receive. There is a very big imbalance there that really does need to be addressed in terms of generating support for return. I think we have to be very mindful of countries that are grappling with huge economic difficulties, including with the COVID-19 pandemic still raging in many parts of the world, that we need to do something to address this imbalance between remittances from migrants and the amount of development assistance that's provided. And then another measure, I think, is the support to many countries outside of the European Union in developing their own registration and national identification systems. I think some EU member states take it for granted that when seeking to return an individual, that they will have a passport or an ID card or some form of national ID. For some people, they don't have that, or they can't access that in their own country. It also means that they're unable to avail of legal mobility pathways if they themselves can't apply for a national ID card or a passport or have national registration. So we would see an investment by European Union member states in developing registration practices and ability to attain identity in those countries as a way to promote the kind of migration that we do see in the African continent, which is within the free movement of travel in the ECOWAS area and other places, and not leave people in a position where they can't avail of legal migration routes because they can't access ID, they can't apply for visas. And then coming back to the final point is around the possibility to really effectively access visas. I think we know, as the ambassador has mentioned, that there's a very high rejection rate for visas. Many member states are not under any obligation to provide reasons for the rejection of visas. So I think we need to bring that balance back into the discussion, and perhaps a focus on addressing those kind of obstacles and problems would lead to a more proportionate response.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I was just giving a sign for the microphone for the next question, so I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
We have another question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Ralf Genetzke. I'm the director of the International Center for Migration Policy Development, ICMPD, the Brussels office. Allow me one comment and one question. And I would like to link to where the ambassador of Nigeria, I think you said it, cooperation is possible. And State Secretary, you said based on the recognition of the mutual legitimate interests. And I think that from ICMPD side is exactly our experience in our work with Nigeria, where we work we are a migration organization. We work on the pure migration issues with your authorities. At the same time, we have an important initiative where we're building up a business park together with local partners, so we attract European investment from Austria, from Germany. We're building, we are working on vocational training, so skills. Linked to that, you can have a labor migration component. So we are thinking migration partnerships very broadly, and I would say inspired also by the Swiss example. Linked to that, possibly my question is a little bit surprising, because we believe very much in migration partnerships. Now my question would be, do you see any limits to migration partnerships? And I'm asking this because we just a few weeks ago had our annual conference with the title Reshaping, Rethinking Migration Partnerships. And there was the one topic which invited itself on the agenda of any of our panels. That was the situation at not only at the Belarus border, but at many spots at the external border of the EU. And we had long discussions about geopolitics. So do we have to think different about the external dimension of the EU in our current global world, where from the Balkans to Turkey, eastern border, Mediterranean, we speak and think, have to think, I think, more about sort of geopolitical influence, foreign policy, and what role do you see in there, for the topic of migration? Thank you.
Secretary Gattiker.
Yes, the limit of the migration partnership. I think migration management as a whole cannot be a solution for a lot of problems which we have in the world. It can focus on migration, and linked to that create some perspective, but it can never be an answer to the demographic situation, to the economic perspective of one country. So we should also think, I think we should also be a little bit, what is the term, bescheiden? Modest, c'est modeste en français, hein? Modest? Yeah, okay. We should a little bit be modest as migration officials. Let me when you allowed, say something quickly to the return, the question also of the ECRE representative. It is, with regard to return, it's very important to not only see return as a technical issue in the end of an asylum procedure, because we have, I can say as Switzerland, we have really good figures of controlled departures after asylum procedure. And that has a lot to do that we integrated into the asylum procedure itself elements to stimulate returns for those who have not a perspective. So, for example, legal representatives are a key instrument for increasing the will to return, because as independent representative, they can give to the asylum seeker a quite independent opinion on the perspective of the claim. On the other hand, we have also in our reception facilities, we proceed all the asylum procedures in quite complex reception facilities. We integrated counseling of return even in the days before starting asylum procedures, to give alternatives for those who realize that they will never have protection in Switzerland. Financial assistance, and then it's clear what is really important, this external dimension, because the attitude, the perspective created on the ground after return are very important. So, and I think we think often too much return just as a technical problem, and it is not. It has really a huge dimension. And I'm also I share your analysis 100%. We have also to protect asylum as a right, as a fundamental right, and therefore we are obliged to make a clear and very tough separation between grounds which are really protected by international law and all the others. But we have to take also all the others reasons into account. But often then the answer is not in the migration management.
Thank you. Maybe your take on this geopolitical, how does one deal with Belarus or other countries where it's quite difficult to have partnerships, I guess?
Mm-hmm. I think in terms of the question, Ralph, of ICMPD that you've raised around the limits to migration partnerships, I think a key limit is that if states don't respect the rule of law, then it's very difficult to develop these kinds of partnerships. And unfortunately, we have seen within the European Union a move away from full respect for the rule of law. It's beyond just the area of asylum and migration. It's in broader areas where there's a bit of a crisis when it comes to the rule of law. But in the asylum and migration area, we see that basic EU law on asylum and refugee issues is not being fully respected at the moment. And it was very good to see the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, yesterday calling on EU member states in the Belarus context to meet their legal obligations and to live up to international law. So I think the development of these partnerships, a prerequisite for that is that the rule of law is respected. And that shouldn't be a problem for the European Union, which is founded on the rule of law. But it's something that we need to really jealously protect and guard, that the rule of law is protected and respected in the European Union. On the Belarus situation, UNHCR together with IOM and the Red Cross are on the ground in Belarus. We have been granted some access by the Belarus authorities to a facility where nearly 2,000 men, women and children are being hosted at the moment. We're providing humanitarian assistance. We're doing what we can to try and alleviate the terrible humanitarian suffering of these people in this dire situation in Belarus. We have colleagues, as I say, more colleagues on mission there at the moment, looking to work towards solutions. It is unfortunate that despite repeatedly asking, UNHCR, IOM, the Red Cross and media have not been granted access to the EU side of the border in Poland. We've not been granted access within the emergency zone. We'd like to see that improve. We also welcome the calls from key EU leaders for that access to be provided. So I think the geopolitical dynamics are obviously very difficult to manage. We need to continue to rely on political leadership from EU member states. We've seen some diplomatic breakthroughs in recent days with the support of key political leaders in the European Union. But one, I think, key aspect in trying to protect against geopolitical threats is that the European Union lives up to its legal obligations, its values, and recalls that liberal democracies will always have a vulnerable and weak point in relation to the kinds of scenarios that we see in Belarus. But the best approach is to retain and stand up for your principles and find diplomatic solutions. There's been some progress in recent days, which we hope to build on together with key EU member states. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll take one question from the online, one question in the room, but you will have to make your answer short. Sorry for that. So, I mean, it might not be that easy because the question is general. How do you assess the current dynamic on the external dimension at European level on this issue? Does the partnership approach seem realistic? Well, I guess you already touched a lot on that, but do you think it's going to get somewhere? Maybe.
I'll give a very short answer and say yes, I think it's got lots of possibilities to develop. There are great opportunities to build something through the partnership approach, but a prerequisite is some movement as well on the internal dimension.
Thank you.
Yes, the approach is correct, but we cannot, as Switzerland, we do not have access to this discussion because that's purely EU. Yes.
No, sorry.
So,
I'm making signals to for the next.
Yes, we do not have any idea how the discussion progresses on external dimension. As an associated Schengen state, we can only say it's very difficult, the discussion and the progress on the package as a whole.
Thank you. So maybe the last question.
Thank you very
giving me 30 seconds. But I'm working with Sophie at the UNHCR office, but and my name is Isabelle Ory. But I'm moreover a long-time observer and actor in the EU migration policies. And I will make just 2 comments, so not necessarily questions, to complement what Ralph said, and that I think the limits of the migration partnerships is exactly a reason why terming external dimension of migration versus an internal dimension of migration, the 2 sides of the coin, is misleading, because it's because of these limits, because by nature of the migration phenomenon, there are geopolitical elements in the relationship between the countries. And that's why I think migration should be a full-fledged area of foreign affairs, to be dealt by the foreign affairs ministries and to be dealt by the respective authorities, as much as agriculture and energy are an area of foreign affairs of international negotiations. And I think that's the place where it should be, and where broader perspectives would be taken into account. Then a second comment, if you allow me, a very important point. I think it was very interesting, State Secretary, that you mentioned that migration, irregular migration, trafficking of human beings is a problem for both sides, and not only for the EU. It's also for the partner country a problem, obviously. And I think this is good also to remember, for the EU to remember. But on the other hand, there is the issue that Sophie mentioned, which is the remittances. The World Bank has issued last week a report on the magnitude of remittances in the world, and to give the magnitude is 3.5 the ODA quantity in the world. And I think it's probably very difficult to quantify what is remittances from regular migration as opposed to remittances from irregular migration. There must be ways, and there are probably some people are probably assessing that. But the question then, or the comment, is how to square the circle of something that is a problem on both sides, but is also benefiting if we talk about irregular migration, is also benefiting the origin countries by and large, if you see what I mean. So squaring that circle is difficult. Would be interesting to hear Nigeria ambassador on this problem and benefit from the same source at the same time. If I made myself clear, thank you.
Thank you. Maybe you could talk afterwards, but I think we're getting to the end of our time. Well, thank you for the good discussion, and thank you to our panelists. What I'll keep in mind, I think, is respect, trust, and if you build a partnership, you have to build it with a partner and not just with yourself. Thanks. So thank you very much for those of you who followed us online. Maybe one last thing before you go. There should be a survey or a few questions appearing on your screens, and please, if you could take a few seconds to answer those questions, it would help us very much for the next Swiss breakfast to improve them even. And with that would be my last word. Thank you very much for all of you for being with us today. Bye-bye.